The biggest mistake in business is assuming you know who matters. The words were calm, almost casual, but they landed in the room a fraction of a second before everything changed. 42 stories above Manhattan, inside a boardroom wrapped in glass and steel, 20 executives sat around a polished walnut table worth more than most people's cars. The skyline shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sunlight bounced off neighboring towers and painted long silver streaks across the conference room floor. At the head of the table sat Charlotte Sterling, CEO of Sterling Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing technology firms in the country. Her navy designer suit was flawless. Her posture was perfect. Her confidence filled the room before she even spoke. On the giant presentation screen behind her, a bold headline glowed in blue letters: Future Expansion Strategy. Every seat in the room was occupied by investors, consultants, attorneys, and senior executives. Every seat except one. A man stood quietly near the back wall. Elijah Brooks adjusted the sleeve of his charcoal jacket and studied the numbers on the screen. He looked completely ordinary. No luxury watch. No visible security detail. No entourage. Just a tall black man with calm eyes and a worn leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm. Most people in the room hadn't noticed him. The few who did assumed he was support staff or an assistant waiting for someone important. Charlotte continued, speaking confidently. Within 18 months, we project a 42% increase in market penetration. Heads nodded around the table. Several investors exchanged approving glances. The atmosphere felt smooth, controlled, almost rehearsed. Then Elijah noticed something. His eyes narrowed slightly. One figure buried inside the forecast projections didn't match the supporting data. It wasn't obvious. In fact, it was hidden so well that most people would never catch it. But Elijah had spent decades analyzing risk. He knew the difference between optimism and reality. Slowly, he raised a hand. The room barely noticed. Charlotte did. Her smile faded by half an inch. Yes, she asked. Elijah spoke evenly. Your overseas expansion assumptions don't align with the supply chain numbers from Q3. Silence. Not complete silence. Just enough to make people glance up from their tablets. Charlotte stared at him for a moment. Excuse me. Elijah stepped forward slightly. The projected growth rate assumes manufacturing capacity that doesn't currently exist. If those numbers don't change, investors could be looking at a very different outcome. A few executives shifted uncomfortably. One board member frowned at the screen. Another opened a spreadsheet on his laptop. Charlotte's jaw tightened. The interruption wasn't part of the plan. And who exactly are you? She asked. Several people turned fully toward Elijah now. He remained calm. My name is Elijah Brooks. Charlotte waited. Nothing followed. No title. No company name. No explanation. Just a name. A faint chuckle came from one side of the room. Someone whispered, "Is he even on the investor list?" More laughter followed. Charlotte crossed her arms. Mr. Brooks, this meeting is reserved for approved participants. Elijah met her eyes. Then perhaps someone should review those projections before decisions are made. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Charlotte's expression hardened completely. Security, she said. The word cut through the room like a blade. 2 building security officers appeared near the doorway. Please escort Mr. Brooks out. The room relaxed immediately. Nervous smiles returned. A few people shook their heads. One investor muttered, "Some people just like hearing themselves talk." Elijah looked around the room one last time. Not angry, not embarrassed, just thoughtful. As the security officers guided him toward the door, his gaze drifted back to the giant screen glowing behind Charlotte Sterling. The projections remained unchanged. The applause returned. The presentation resumed. And as the glass doors quietly closed behind him, not a single person in that room realized they had just asked the only man capable of saving their company to leave. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Elijah Brooks stepped into the marble lobby without looking back. Behind him, 42 floors. Above the city, the meeting continued as if nothing had happened. The revolving doors turned slowly in the afternoon sunlight. Outside, yellow taxis rolled past the tower, their reflections sliding across the glass facade like streams of gold. Elijah adjusted the strap of his leather portfolio and walked toward the curb. No frustration showed on his face. No anger. No urgency. Just the quiet composure of a man who had spent most of his life being underestimated. A black sedan pulled alongside him. The driver stepped out immediately. "Good afternoon, sir." Elijah nodded and entered the rear seat. The city drifted by beyond the tinted windows. Street vendors packed sidewalks. Construction cranes stretched above new towers. Delivery trucks rumbled through intersections. New York moved with its usual rhythm, completely unaware that one of the most influential investors in the country had just been removed from a meeting where nobody bothered to learn his name. 30 minutes later, the sedan rolled through iron gates and disappeared beneath a private residential tower overlooking Central Park. The lobby was lined with white stone and warm oak. A concierge greeted Elijah by name before the elevator carried him to the top floor. The doors opened directly into a penthouse surrounded by glass. Sunlight spilled across polished hardwood floors. Beyond the windows, Manhattan stretched for miles. Elijah placed his portfolio on a table and loosened his tie. His assistant, Rebecca Lawson, was already waiting beside the kitchen island with a tablet in her hands. "How did the meeting go?" she asked. Elijah walked toward the window. For a moment, he watched a helicopter drift across the skyline. Then he smiled faintly. "Exactly as expected." Rebecca sighed. "They still do not know who you are." "No, not even Charlotte Sterling?" Elijah shook his head. "Especially not Charlotte Sterling." Rebecca looked down at her tablet. "The board requested access to our expansion fund 3 months ago." "I know. And you declined." "I did." Silence settled between them. Below, traffic flowed through the streets like rivers of light. Rebecca finally looked up. "Then why attend the presentation?" Elijah folded his arms. "Because I wanted to see whether leadership could recognize risk when it stood directly in front of them." Rebecca understood immediately. She had worked with Elijah for nearly 12 years. She knew his habits, his instincts, the way he studied people long before he studied numbers. "And?" she asked quietly. Elijah's reflection stared back at him from the glass. "The projections were wrong." "Badly? Bad enough?" Rebecca frowned. "Should we warn them?" Elijah remained silent for several seconds. Across the city, storm clouds were beginning to gather beyond the Hudson River. Their shadows crept slowly across the skyline. Finally, he answered. They were warned. Meanwhile, inside Sterling Dynamics, Charlotte Sterling stood in her executive office reviewing reports. The city looked magnificent from her corner suite, but she barely noticed. Her attention remained fixed on growth charts and investor commitments. The interruption from earlier had already faded from her mind. To her, the unknown man had simply been another distraction. Another voice questioning a strategy she had spent months building. She pressed a button on her desk phone. "Send me the final investor confirmations." Minutes later, a stack of reports arrived. Charlotte began reading. Everything looked strong. Everything looked secure. Everything looked exactly as planned. But 2,000 miles away in Chicago, one major institutional investor was preparing an announcement that would change everything. And by the time Charlotte Sterling learned what was coming, the man she dismissed that afternoon would be the last person she could afford to ignore. By 7 o'clock the next morning, the storm had arrived. Rain tapped softly against the glass walls of Sterling Dynamics headquarters while employees streamed through the lobby carrying umbrellas and coffee cups. The building buzzed with its usual energy. Screens glowed. Elevators opened and closed. Conversations echoed through hallways lined with polished steel and marble. From the outside, everything looked exactly the same. Inside Charlotte Sterling's executive suite, however, the atmosphere was beginning to shift. She stood beside her desk reviewing overnight market updates. A steaming cup of coffee sat untouched nearby. Her attention locked onto a message flashing across her monitor. One of Sterling Dynamics' largest institutional investors had requested an emergency call. Charlotte frowned. The request itself was unusual. The timing was worse. She pressed the call button immediately. Seconds later, the face of Robert Langford appeared on the screen. The veteran fund manager looked tired. His silver tie was slightly crooked. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. "Charlotte," he said quietly, "I wanted you to hear this directly from me." Something in his voice made her stomach tighten. "What is it?" Robert exhaled slowly. "Our board voted late last night." Charlotte waited. Rain streaked down the windows behind her. "We are withdrawing our participation from the expansion round." The office suddenly felt smaller. Charlotte straightened. "You are doing what?" The risk profile changed. "Based on what?" Robert hesitated. "Several concerns emerged during our review." Charlotte's jaw tightened. Concerns that somehow appeared overnight? Robert looked away from the camera for a moment. We found inconsistencies in the projected manufacturing capacity. The words landed heavily. For a brief second, Charlotte remembered the interruption from the previous afternoon. The man standing near the back wall. The comment about supply chain numbers. She pushed the thought away immediately. Coincidence. Nothing more. Those projections were reviewed by multiple teams, she replied. I understand. Then this makes no sense. Robert remained silent. That silence told her more than any explanation could. The call ended 5 minutes later. Charlotte stared at the dark monitor. The rain continued falling outside. Across the office, her phone rang almost instantly. Then again, and again. Another investor. Another analyst. Another request for clarification. By 9 o'clock, concern had spread through the executive floor. By 10 o'clock, concern had become anxiety. In conference rooms throughout the building, teams rushed through spreadsheets and forecasts. Senior managers moved quickly. Between offices carrying reports, voices grew sharper. Meetings multiplied. Questions appeared faster than answers. Meanwhile, 30 blocks away, Elijah Brooks sat comfortably inside a private conference room overlooking Central Park. Morning sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting soft reflections across the glass table. Rebecca Lawson placed a folder in front of him. The first withdrawal happened exactly as expected, she said. Elijah opened the folder. Inside were updated market reports and investor communications. He scanned them calmly. No surprise crossed his face. No satisfaction either. Just quiet observation. Rebecca took a seat across from him. Sterling Dynamics is already feeling pressure. Elijah nodded. Pressure reveals character. Rebecca studied him. Do you think Charlotte understands what is happening? Elijah looked toward the skyline. The clouds were beginning to break apart above Manhattan. Thin rays of sunlight pushed through the gray. Not yet, he said. Right now she thinks she has a financial problem. Rebecca waited. Elijah closed the folder gently. Soon she will realize she has a leadership problem. At that exact moment, inside Sterling Dynamics headquarters, Charlotte opened another report. Her eyes moved across the page, then suddenly stopped. A single name appeared repeatedly throughout investor communications from the last 12 hours. The same name, over and over again. Elijah Brooks. Charlotte stared at the page. For the first time since the crisis began, she felt something colder than concern settle into her chest. Because somehow, the man she had dismissed yesterday seemed to be standing at the center of everything happening today. Charlotte Sterling read the name again. Elijah Brooks. The letters seemed ordinary on the page, yet they appeared everywhere she looked. Investor correspondence, internal memos, market briefings, risk assessments. The same names surfaced again and again like a thread woven through every problem now surrounding her company. Outside her office, activity intensified across the executive floor. Phones rang constantly. Analysts hurried between conference rooms carrying laptops and financial reports. The steady confidence that had defined Sterling Dynamics for years was beginning to crack. Charlotte stood and walked toward the windows. Rain clouds were finally breaking apart, allowing thin beams of sunlight to spill across Manhattan. Normally the view calmed her. Today it did nothing. She turned toward her assistant. Find everything we have on Elijah Brooks. Her assistant blinked. Everything. Everything. Within an hour, a thick folder arrived on her desk. Charlotte opened it immediately. The first page contained almost nothing. No interviews. No social media presence. No magazine profiles. No television appearances. The lack of information was almost unsettling. She continued reading. Then her eyes widened. Several private companies. Multiple technology holdings. Strategic investments across energy, infrastructure, healthcare, and logistics. Quiet acquisitions stretching back nearly 15 years. The numbers became larger with every page she turned. Larger than she expected. Larger than she imagined. Finally, she reached a summary prepared by one of her analysts. Estimated net worth, several $billion. Charlotte slowly lowered the folder. The room felt completely silent. Yesterday, she had dismissed a man whose financial influence exceeded that of many institutions she worked with. Her assistant noticed the change in her expression. Is something wrong? Charlotte looked at the file again. We removed him from the meeting. The assistant hesitated. You did not know who he was. Charlotte stared toward the city. For the first time, that explanation sounded weak. Across town, Elijah sat alone inside a quiet library located within his penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls. Afternoon light rested softly across rows of books. A grandfather clock ticked gently in the corner. Unlike the chaos unfolding at Sterling Dynamics, the atmosphere here felt calm, deliberate, peaceful. Elijah sat in a leather chair reviewing quarterly reports while a jazz record played quietly nearby. Rebecca entered carrying another tablet. The second investor withdrawal is official. Elijah nodded. Expected. The market noticed. Of course. Rebecca sat across from him. Charlotte requested background information on you less than an hour ago. Elijah closed the report in his hands. The corners of his mouth lifted slightly. Not with pride. Not with satisfaction. More like understanding. Then she has finally started asking the right questions. Rebecca studied him carefully. Do you enjoy this? Elijah looked toward the sunlight falling across the floor. No. Then why attend the meeting at all? He remained quiet for a moment. The ticking clock filled the room. Finally he answered. Because companies rise and fall based on decisions made in rooms like that. Rebecca waited. Elijah folded his hands. I wanted to know whether Sterling Dynamics was led by someone willing to listen. Across the city, Charlotte sat alone after most of her team had left for the evening. The office lights reflected against the darkening glass. She opened the file once more. This time she noticed a smaller section near the end. Philanthropic investments, scholarships, workforce development programs, community technology centers. Millions of dollars directed toward people who would never know his name. Charlotte stared at the page. It did not match the image she had built in her mind. Not at all. Then her phone vibrated. An incoming message from the board chairman appeared on the screen. She opened it immediately. The message contained only one sentence. We need Elijah Brooks at the table before this situation gets worse. Charlotte slowly looked back toward the skyline. The city lights were beginning to glow beneath the fading sunset. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had viewed Elijah Brooks as someone who did not belong in her boardroom. Now the future of her company might depend on convincing him to walk back into it. The next morning arrived under a pale gray sky. Low clouds drifted above Manhattan, while the city slowly came alive beneath them. Commuters filled sidewalks. Steam rose from street grates. Taxi horns echoed between glass towers. Yet inside Sterling Dynamics, the atmosphere felt nothing like a normal business day. Tension lingered in every hallway, every conference room, every conversation. Charlotte Sterling entered the executive floor before sunrise. She had barely slept. The file on Elijah Brooks remained tucked beneath her arm, its edges worn from being opened and reopened throughout the night. As she stepped into the boardroom, the same room where everything had begun, she noticed something different. The confidence that usually filled the space was gone. The 20-foot windows still overlooked the city. The polished walnut table still reflected the morning light. But now the room carried uncertainty. Board members were already seated. Several avoided eye contact. Others stared silently at financial reports spread across the table. Charlotte took her seat. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, the chairman cleared his throat. We need solutions. His voice sounded heavier than usual. A chief financial officer slid a report across the table. 2 additional investment groups have paused discussions. Another executive added, market confidence is weakening faster than projected. The chairman folded his hands. And Elijah Brooks? The room fell silent again. Charlotte felt every eye turned toward her. She looked down briefly before answering. We have not contacted him yet. The chairman's expression tightened. Then that needs to change today. Across town, sunlight filtered softly through the windows of Elijah's penthouse library. The storm had passed. The city below shimmered beneath clear skies. Elijah sat at a long wooden table reviewing scholarship applications. Hundreds of names filled the pages before him. Students, veterans, small business owners, people seeking opportunities they otherwise could not afford. Rebecca entered quietly. Sterling Dynamics called. Elijah continued reading. I assumed they would. 3 times already. He placed one application aside. Did you answer? No. Elijah nodded calmly. Rebecca studied him. You know they are desperate. I know they are concerned. There is a difference. Elijah smiled faintly. A very large one. He rose and walked toward the windows. Below, Central Park stretched across the city like a patch of green surrounded by steel and glass. Morning runners moved along winding paths. Children played near open fields. Life continued without concern for stock prices or board meetings. Rebecca approached the window beside him. "Do you intend to meet with Charlotte?" Elijah remained silent. The sunlight reflected softly against the glass. Finally he answered, "Eventually." "Why not now?" Elijah folded his hands behind his back. "Because the lesson is not finished." Back at Sterling Dynamics, Charlotte stood alone after another difficult meeting. She stared through the same glass doors where Elijah had been escorted out less than 2 days earlier. The memory felt sharper now, more uncomfortable. She remembered his calm voice, the warning about manufacturing capacity, the confidence that never wavered despite the laughter in the room. For the first time, she asked herself a question she had avoided until now. What if he had only been trying to help? The thought lingered, unwelcome but impossible to ignore. Her assistant entered carrying a tablet. "There is something else you should see." Charlotte looked down at the screen. A news article had just been published. The headline mentioned Elijah Brooks and one of his recent investments. She opened it. Then another article. And another. As she read, a picture emerged that made her stomach sink. Over the last decade, Elijah had quietly transformed struggling companies across the country. Not by taking control, not by chasing headlines, by helping leadership teams recognize problems they refused to see. Charlotte lowered the tablet slowly. Outside her office, employees continued moving through the halls unaware of what she had just learned. Inside, however, something shifted. For the first time since the crisis began, she no longer viewed Elijah Brooks as a potential investor. She viewed him as the one person who had seen the danger before anyone else. And the realization arrived with a painful truth. If she had listened for 30 seconds that day, none of this might be happening now. That evening, the city seemed quieter than usual. The rush of traffic below Charlotte Sterling's office sounded distant, softened by the thick glass walls surrounding the executive floor. Most employees had already gone home. The bright energy that normally filled Sterling Dynamics after a successful quarter had been replaced by an uneasy stillness. Charlotte stood alone beside the window, looking down at the streams of headlights moving through Manhattan. In her hand was a printed photograph she had found among the research reports about Elijah Brooks. It was not a photograph of a boardroom, not a corporate event, not an award ceremony. Elijah was standing beside a group of high school students in front of a small technology center somewhere in Ohio. There were no cameras focused on him, no reporters, no spotlight, just genuine smiles. Charlotte studied the image for several seconds. Then she placed it on her desk and sat down. For the first time in years, she was not thinking about market share, quarterly growth, or investor confidence. She was thinking about a decision. One decision, less than a minute long. A moment she could not undo. Across the city, Elijah sat on the rooftop terrace of his penthouse. The evening air was cool. A gentle breeze moved between the surrounding towers. Above him, the last colors of sunset faded from orange into deep blue. A cup of coffee rested beside him on a small wooden table. Rebecca stepped outside carrying a folder. "Another message from Sterling Dynamics," she said. Elijah looked toward the skyline. "How many now?" 8. A faint smile crossed his face. Persistent. Rebecca sat across from him. "They're not asking for money anymore." That caught his attention. He turned slightly. "No." She opened the folder. The latest message simply asks for a conversation. Silence settled between them. Far below, the city glowed with thousands of lights. Elijah accepted the folder and read the message himself. It was brief, professional, direct, yet something about it felt different from the earlier requests. Less desperate, more honest. He closed the folder and rested it on the table. Rebecca watched him carefully. "What are you thinking?" Elijah leaned back and looked at the stars beginning to appear above the skyline. "I am thinking about employees. Not Charlotte." He shook his head. "Never Charlotte." Rebecca understood immediately. Sterling Dynamics employed thousands of people. Engineers, designers, technicians, administrative staff. Families depended on those paychecks. Careers depended on the company's survival. Elijah had spent years investing in people, not just businesses. That distinction mattered. Back inside Sterling Dynamics headquarters, Charlotte remained at her desk long after sunset. The executive floor was almost empty now. Shadows stretched across the hallways. The hum of the building's ventilation system filled the silence. She opened her laptop and began reviewing old meeting recordings. one after another, looking for something, anything. Eventually, she found the footage from 2 days earlier. She watched herself speaking confidently at the front of the room, watched investors nodding, watched executives taking notes. Then she saw Elijah standing near the back wall, calm, respectful, patient. She listened carefully as he spoke. The warning lasted less than 30 seconds. 30 seconds. That was all. Charlotte paused the recording. The screen froze on Elijah's face. A man she had judged without knowing. A man who had seen the problem before anyone else. Outside, the city lights reflected against the glass. Inside, Charlotte slowly closed the laptop. Tomorrow she would make the call herself. Not as a chief executive seeking capital. Not as a powerful leader trying to save a company. But as someone finally ready to listen. The next morning arrived bright and clear. Sunlight poured across Manhattan, reflecting from thousands of windows and turning the city into a landscape of silver and gold. For most people, it was just another business day. For Charlotte Sterling, it felt like the most important morning of her career. She stood alone inside her office before anyone else arrived. A single folder rested on her desk. On the cover was one name, Elijah Brooks. She looked at it for several moments before finally picking up her phone. Her finger hovered over the screen. For the first time in years, she felt nervous about making a call. Not because of money, not because of investors, because she knew she had been wrong. Across the city, Elijah sat inside a quiet conference room on the top floor of his building. Morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. A tray of coffee and pastries rested untouched on a side table. Rebecca sat nearby reviewing schedules. Elijah was reading a report when his phone vibrated softly. The room remained silent. He glanced at the screen. Charlotte Sterling. Rebecca noticed immediately. Are you going to answer? Elijah looked at the name for several seconds. Then he accepted the call. Good morning, Miss Sterling. Charlotte took a breath. Hearing his calm voice somehow made the conversation harder. Mr. Brooks, thank you for taking my call. Of course. A brief silence followed. Charlotte looked out at the skyline beyond her office window. I owe you an apology. Elijah did not respond immediately. He simply listened. Charlotte continued. You tried to warn us. I dismissed you without understanding who you were or what you were trying to say. The words felt heavier than she expected. For years, she had been the person giving instructions, making decisions, leading conversations. Admitting fault did not come naturally. Yet now it felt necessary. On the other end of the line, Elijah remained composed. I appreciate your honesty. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. Would you be willing to meet? Again, silence. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. Finally, Elijah answered. Yes. Charlotte sat up straighter. Thank you. One condition. Anything. Elijah walked toward the windows. Below him, Central Park stretched beneath the morning sun. This meeting is not about investment. Charlotte hesitated. Then what is it about? Elijah's reflection stared back at him from the glass. Understanding why your company missed a problem that was visible to everyone willing to look. Charlotte lowered her gaze. She knew he was right. 2 hours later, a private conference suite had been prepared inside a luxury hotel overlooking the Hudson River. Charlotte arrived early. She wore a simple charcoal suit rather than her usual executive attire. No media, no assistants, no board members, just her. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the city outside. Minutes later, the door opened. Elijah entered alone. Charlotte stood immediately. The difference from their first meeting could not have been more obvious. No laughter, no assumptions, no dismissal, only respect. Elijah crossed the room calmly and took a seat near the windows. Sunlight reflected across the polished table between them. Charlotte studied him for a moment. Everything she had learned over the past 2 days suddenly felt incomplete. The reports, the articles, the financial records. They explained his success, but not the man himself. Then something caught her attention. A framed magazine cover rested inside a display cabinet near the entrance. Charlotte's eyes widened. The publication was one of the most respected financial magazines in the country. The cover story featured a photograph she instantly recognized. Elijah Brooks. She slowly turned back toward him. You are not just an investor, are you? Elijah smiled faintly. No. Charlotte looked again at the cover, then back at the man sitting across from her. In that moment, she finally understood the truth. The person she had removed from her boardroom was not a representative of wealth. He was the source of it. Charlotte sat quietly for several seconds after that realization settled in. Sunlight poured through the tall windows overlooking the Hudson River, casting bright reflections across the polished conference table. The room felt different now, smaller somehow, not because of its size, but because many of the assumptions she had carried into it were disappearing one by one. Elijah Brooks was not simply a successful investor. He was the founder of the investment group, the strategist behind billions of dollars in successful acquisitions, the man whose decisions influenced entire industries. Yet he sat across from her without arrogance, without an entourage, and without any need to prove who he was. Charlotte folded her hands carefully. I spent 2 days reading about your companies. Elijah listened. I read about your investments, your technology centers, your workforce programs, your scholarships. She paused briefly. What I do not understand is why someone with your resources still attends meetings personally. Elijah smiled faintly. Because spreadsheets do not make decisions. People do. The answer lingered in the air. Outside, a ferry moved slowly along the river below. Sunlight sparkled across the water. Charlotte looked down at the table. Then I failed your test. Elijah shook his head gently. It was not a test. It felt like one. No. His voice remained calm. I simply wanted to understand how leadership responded when challenged. Charlotte nodded slowly. She could not argue with that. For years, she had built her reputation on confidence and decisiveness. Those traits had helped her company grow. But somewhere along the way, confidence had begun replacing curiosity. Certainty had started replacing listening. Elijah leaned back slightly in his chair. The issue was never the projection numbers. Charlotte looked up. It was not. No. Elijah folded his hands. Numbers can be corrected. She waited. Culture is harder. The word struck deeper than any criticism she had received from investors or board members. Because she knew exactly what he meant. Nobody in that room had asked questions. Nobody had paused long enough to examine the warning. They had simply followed her lead. Charlotte looked toward the windows. The city stretched endlessly beneath the afternoon sun. Thousands of businesses. Millions of people. Endless opportunities. Endless mistakes. I thought leadership meant having answers, she admitted quietly. Elijah nodded. Most people do. What does it mean to you? A gentle silence followed. Then Elijah glanced toward the skyline. Creating an environment where the best idea matters more than the title of the person who says it. Charlotte lowered her gaze. For a moment, she remembered the laughter in the boardroom. The assumptions. The dismissal. None of it felt impressive anymore. It felt expensive. Elijah noticed the regret in her expression. You are not the first executive to make that mistake. Maybe not. Charlotte exhaled slowly. But it was still my mistake. Elijah studied her for a moment. Then he nodded once. The acknowledgement seemed to matter more than any apology. The room grew quiet again. Afternoon light shifted gradually across the floor. Finally, Charlotte spoke. I owe you something else. Elijah raised an eyebrow slightly. What is that? Gratitude. The answer surprised even her. You could have ignored us. Elijah remained silent. You could have walked away and watched everything unfold. Charlotte looked directly at him. Instead, you tried to help before any of this happened. For the first time, Elijah looked away toward the river. The sunlight reflected softly across the glass. I was not thinking about your company. Charlotte frowned slightly. No. Elijah shook his head. I was thinking about the people inside it. The answer changed everything. Because in that moment, Charlotte finally understood something the reports had never fully explained. Elijah Brooks was not driven by money. He was driven by responsibility. And that realization made what happened next even more surprising. Elijah reached into his portfolio, removed a thin folder, and gently placed it on the table between them. Charlotte glanced down at it, then back at him. What is this? Elijah's expression remained impossible to read. A proposal. Charlotte stared at the folder. Less than 48 hours earlier, she had removed him from her boardroom. Now he was placing something on the table that could change the future of her company. The only question was whether it was an offer to help or a final reason to walk away. Charlotte stared at the folder resting on the table between them. For a moment, neither of them moved. Afternoon sunlight shimmered across the Hudson River outside, sending waves of golden light dancing across the walls of the conference suite. The city beyond the glass continued its endless motion, unaware that a decision inside this quiet room was about to change the future of thousands of people. Slowly, Charlotte opened the folder. The first page was not a financial agreement. It was not a demand for control. It was not a list of conditions designed to punish anyone. Instead, it was a recovery plan. Detailed, practical, thorough. Elijah had identified operational weaknesses, supply chain vulnerabilities, leadership blind spots, and realistic growth targets. Every recommendation focused on strengthening the company, rather than exploiting its problems. Charlotte turned another page, then another. The deeper she read, the more stunned she became. This was not the work of someone seeking revenge. This was the work of someone trying to help. Finally, she looked up. "You prepared all of this?" Elijah nodded. "Weeks ago." Charlotte blinked. "Before any of this happened?" "Yes." The answer left her speechless. She lowered her eyes to the documents again. The realization settled heavily over her. Before the crisis, before the board meetings, before the investor withdrawals, before the embarrassment, before the apology, Elijah had already been trying to protect the company. The silence in the room deepened. Charlotte carefully closed the folder. "Why?" she asked quietly. Elijah looked toward the river. A ferry moved slowly through the sunlight below. "Because I believe the company was worth saving." Charlotte swallowed hard. Even after what happened, for the first time, Elijah smiled. Not a triumphant smile. Not a bitter one. Just calm understanding. What happened lasted less than a minute. The people working inside your company matter far more than that. Charlotte felt her throat tighten. There was no accusation in his voice. No resentment. Somehow that made the lesson even more powerful. A week later, Sterling Dynamics held its first board meeting since the crisis began. The atmosphere inside the room was completely different. The same walnut table stood beneath the same floor-to-ceiling windows. The same skyline stretched beyond the glass. Yet everything had changed. Board members listened more carefully. Executives asked more questions. Assumptions were challenged. Ideas were examined. The culture itself had begun to shift. At the end of the meeting, a final agreement was signed. Elijah's investment group committed $500 million to support the company's recovery and long-term growth. Applause filled the room. But Elijah remained calm. The investment was never the real victory. Across the table, Charlotte watched him sign the final page. Then she remembered the day he first stood in that room. The quiet warning. The laughter. The dismissal. She glanced toward the same doorway where he had once been escorted out. Then she looked back at him. "Thank you," she said. Elijah simply nodded. The meeting ended. One by one, people left the boardroom. Eventually, only sunlight remained, stretching across the polished table. Elijah gathered his portfolio and walked toward the exit. Charlotte stood as he passed. Not because of his wealth, not because of his influence, but because respect had finally replaced assumption. As the doors closed softly behind him, she turned toward the windows. The city glowed beneath the late afternoon sun. Somewhere below, thousands of employees continued building products, solving problems, and planning for the future. Their jobs were secure. Their company had another chance. And Charlotte understood something she would never forget. Leadership was not about being the smartest person in the room. It was about being wise enough to listen when wisdom arrived in unexpected clothes. Outside, golden light washed across the glass towers of Manhattan. Elijah stepped onto the sidewalk and disappeared into the crowd, carrying the same worn leather portfolio he had carried from the beginning. No spotlight followed him. No celebration surrounded him. Just the quiet dignity of a man who never needed recognition to do the right thing. And high above the city, in a boardroom filled with sunlight and silence, the lesson he left behind remained.